This particular video then is going to look at the learning theory of attachment. We've already looked at the learning theory for abnormality and how that brings about different phobias, and it's a very similar process here. So we can see it's using all those similar words like unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, but this time we're going to be applying it to attachment. The learning theory states that we learn to form attachments, and it's also called the cupboard love theory because it puts an awful lot of emphasis on the importance of the caregiver as a provider of food. So food is the main thing that helps form an attachment. Children learn to love and form attachments with caregivers because basically they bring them food. That's the only reason we really start to form an attachment, due to this theory. So we've got classical and operant conditioning as ways that we learn to form attachments. And again, like I said, it's very similar to what you did when we looked at how we develop phobias. So before conditioning, we've got an unconditioned stimulus, which is the food here. Okay, and food brings about the unconditioned response of pleasure. Remember, these are unconditioned because they are natural, they are innate. Food brings about the unconditioned response of pleasure. And if I was writing this up in an example, I would also bring up here the fact we have a neutral stimulus. And the neutral stimulus in this case would be the mother. And a neutral stimulus brings about no response. Okay, and no response in the child whatsoever. So if I was writing this up, and this is very hard to write on, the neutral stimulus of the mother brings about no response. Okay, so I might put that a little bit in if I was writing an exam answer. Then we come on to the idea of the conditioning starts to begin. So we've got the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and now it's being brought to the child by the neutral stimulus, the mother. And that brings about the unconditioned response of pleasure. So the child's still getting the pleasure because it's getting the food. And eventually this happens over and over and over and over again. The unconditioned stimulus is brought with the neutral stimulus and mother, bringing about an unconditioned response. And what happens is the child begins to associate the food with the mother. And after the conditioning has occurred, we get now the mother is the conditioned stimulus. So the mother or the caregiver is a conditioned stimulus, which brings about the conditioned response of pleasure. So it goes through these different stages. And you've got to know what happens before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. It's all about that association the child makes between the food and the primary caregiver. So eventually, you can see a child gets pleasure from the mother because he associates the mother with food. And if you remember back to phobias, we also learned that we learn through operant conditioning as well. And attachment is the exact same. We can also learn it through classical and through operant conditioning. So, for a young baby, they get hungry, which causes them discomfort. So they start to cry. And this brings about a response from the caregiver. So the caregiver brings over some food when they hear the crying. And the food removes all that discomfort and brings the baby some pleasure. So that's the reward there. That's that positive reinforcement that the child would want. So the food becomes the primary reinforcer because that's what's causing the pleasure. And the mother becomes the secondary reinforcer because they're the person who's bringing the food to the child. And attachment starts to occur through this way. So when we look at this little diagram here, you can see the same process just outlined in a slightly different way. So the infant experiences hunger and this discomfort causes it to make noise. So it starts to cry and cry and cry. And then we get comfort is brought by the food. So the food is the primary reinforcer here. Brings food and that rewards the child by taking away the hunger. And then we have the secondary reinforcer, who is the mother, because they're the source that brings the food to the infant. And this is what causes the attachment to begin. The child associates the mother with the food and the reward, so starts to form an attachment with that particular caregiver. So in operant conditioning, when do we actually see reinforcement taking place? Well, when the baby cries, as long as the caregiver brings the food, that crying is reinforced, it's rewarded. And that's what we see as positive reinforcement. The baby cries, it knows that it's going to get fed, so it repeats that behaviour over and over again. It's positive reinforcement because it's being rewarded for crying. And also we have negative reinforcement occurring as well, because when the caregiver gives the baby the food, the baby stops crying. So it stops that particular behaviour. So that's negative reinforcement because it stops a behaviour from occurring. So we've got positive reinforcement when the baby's crying and negative reinforcement when the baby stops crying eventually. So we've had a look at operant and classical conditioning. Hopefully you remember quite a bit of these terms anyway from your phobia lessons. And we're now going to have a look at the evaluation points for this particular theory. And there are studies to contradict it. We've got Harlow's study, which we've already learnt about in the animal studies. The learning theory would suggest that a monkey would spend most of its time with the wire mother, or the mother that provides the food. However, as Harlow found, the monkeys actually spent 22 hours a day with the cloth mother. So it shows that food isn't the most important thing in developing attachment. The most important thing is the sensitivity and the comfort provided by the cloth mother in this particular instance. But there were very, very few studies to support the learning theory. However, there is one conducted by Dollard and Miller. And what they found was that in the first year of their life, a baby is fed over 2,000 times by their main carer, which is usually the mother. So a baby's fed over 2,000 times in that first year. And what Dollard and Miller said was that this is easily enough time for an association to form between the infant and the caregiver. So although it's not an exact finding for this theory, it does show that maybe there is enough opportunity in that first year, if they're fed 2,000 times, for the child to develop an association and an attachment with that caregiver. However, overall, there is very, very little research support for this particular theory. So that reduces the validity of the theory overall. This is probably the only study out there that supports it in a human environment. So, as you can see from the picture, we're going to return to our Schaefer and Emerson and Glaswegian baby study. And remember, they found that attachments develop with those who do not feed the infant. So in Schaefer and Emerson's study, if you remember, many of the babies developed a primary attachment with their biological mother, even though other people were the ones who did the feeding. So this shows us that food and feeding is not the most important thing in developing attachment. That other factors like sensitivity and responding to the needs of a child are more important when developing their primary attachment figure. Well, the final thing I'm going to talk about then is the fact that this theory is based on animal research. If you remember back to Pavlov dogs, and if you want to YouTube maybe Skinner's pigeons, that this theory is based on animal research. And behaviourists believe that animals and humans behave in very, very similar ways. So as a result of that, we can apply our findings from animals to humans. However, conditioning might be able to explain certain simple behaviours in human behaviour. However, attachment itself is a very, very complex behaviour and process that involves an awful lot of emotions and feelings, and because of its complexity, it's very unlikely that something as simple as classical and operant conditioning can explain such a complex behaviour as attachment.